Okay, we're back on track? Yep, back on track. So this space is at last returning to its proper purpose, old food in America. But for those of you who enjoyed this special episode last week, our particular look into Shogun, you can continue to follow along this Friday over at Prize Fighters, Circus Freaks, and Welcome and welcome back. For those of you new to this, about 30 episodes ago, I started highlighting resources out there that can help you expand your access to these sometimes hard to see and easy to forget pieces of history that surround us all the time. I've settled on using the vastly underappreciated national park system as the source of most of these items. I'm constantly amazed at what is out there for each and every one of us as citizens and as visitors to the U.S. And I already appreciated the NPS, but I had no idea just how much I didn't know about how deep their resources are and how many topics they cover and give us access to. As a tribute to the upcoming Madcap season that covers the first half or so of the 19th century, I'm starting with the Oregon National Historic Trail that shares a starting point with the California and Santa Fe National Historic Trails. While many of us have played some version of one of the oldest of old school computer games, Oregon Trail, few of us have thought about the when and how far of the whole thing. But all of us who did play it have a good sense of our extremely excellent chances of dying of dysentery. For a much more informative, more colorful, and less personally lethal visit to the trail, you can visit it at nearly 200 different sites across 7 states to learn about the people who traveled along the trail and were living in the places the emigrants passed by. These cover locations of excitement, hope, despair, awe, and relief. And some of the spots include Mill Creek by the Upper Independence Landing in Missouri, where a huge number of people waited for a crossing of the Missouri River. There's the Mission School in Fairway, Kansas, set up to confine, Christianize, and civilize children taken from both local and recently uprooted and relocated tribes. There's also the Windlass Hill area in Ash Hollow State Park in Nebraska, where a daunting hill and refreshing spring were both encountered. In Wyoming, you can visit Register Cliff, where hundreds of 19th century travelers left their names carved in sandstone. Idaho has one of the most striking sights, Craters of the Moon, a volcanic lava field that proved an almost unbelievable obstacle. I visited this barren stretch of dauntingly sharp rocks that seem to come from nowhere and can only imagine what it must have looked like to 19th century travelers who up until just a moment ago had been walking through seemingly unending fields of rolling grass. In Washington state, there's Fort Vancouver, a British Empire remnant that was still trying to retain a foothold in the future United States of America as pioneers were working to push the country all the way to the other coast. And of course in Oregon there are several spots where people stopped, figuring that they had finally reached there, including the stunning overlook of Rowena Crest, where these travelers viewed the Columbia River, the largest body of water they had seen since they started their trek at the Missouri River. I'll include a link to the website in the show notes so you can check out this daunting trip and the stunning sights on your own, and maybe plan a trip to one part or several. Anyway, Appalachian Trail, you have more competition. Episode 114, America at last. What does it look like now? Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be giving an overview of the big events that are going to happen in the first half, and a little more, of the 19th century, and set up how this period contributed much more to the character of the America we think of when we say United States of America than most of the things that happened in the 18th century. And how the exploration, rapid expansion, and big dreams of these years shaped the food of this country and the world in ways I had never realized. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that this is the time period when the railroad starts And if there is one thing from the past that I think made food American and develop into what it has become today, it was the railroad. It makes us think of distances and time entirely differently than any other country on the earth ever had. It linked relatively cheap and fast overland transport with the growing of food and started to disentangle seasonality and location from food availability in ways that had never been seen anywhere else on earth and at no other time. Unless, of course, you'd been wealthy in ways that were basically incomprehensible to nearly all of humanity. There are many people, including historians who know what they're talking about, that characterize the War of 1812 as sort of part two of the Revolutionary War. At the end of that conflict in 1789, there were a number of British politicians who, until then, thought they could claw back those pesky colonies, or at least hem in the new country with British colonial territory, which would then exert control over the renegades anyway. But with the end of the War of 1812, in 1815, Britain pretty much gave up on that venture. They at least knew when to quit moping over a lost cause. So without the British trying to hold the door of the Appalachians shut, New America was excited to go big, and one of the biggest ideas of the day was railroad travel, and it would eventually blow the doors off the idea of far away in America. The first railroad was planned in the new country in 1827. Construction began in 1828, starting at the port of Baltimore, Maryland, with the goal to travel through the state, across Virginia, later West Virginia, and all the way across to the Ohio River. This would connect the Ohio River, a major arterial for farmers on the flat, productive lands across the Appalachians, to a major shipping port for the country and the world. The Baltimore and Ohio, or the B&O, would allow those farmers to reach the port of Maryland in mere days, and at such a minor cost in time and effort that suddenly large crops of food could be grown and shipped to the big city of Baltimore. And because it was a port, then up and down the eastern seaboard and even globally. Virginia and then West Virginia have been shipping ginseng to China more or less continually since about 1790. Connecting the port of Baltimore to the Ohio River became even more tempting as steamboats started to ply America's large rivers, traveling on water using engines instead of wind, human, and animal power could now be connected with engine-powered travel on land. The project to make the vast area of the new America smaller had begun. And soon the world would start to get closer together as steamship travel took to the oceans in the 1840s, marking the beginning of the end of the age of sail. Side note, new understandings of aerodynamics and sail engineering is bringing wind power back to cargo transport. I mean, we really understand sail power now. Wind doesn't push boats using sails, it pulls them. But back to the railroad travel, it didn't just make the world smaller. It was about to make it run on time, or a smaller number of times. The idea of a single clock for the world would start developing during this age as well. See, up until the early 19th century, every city, town, and village put noon at when the sun was overhead, more or less. I mean, most people didn't have much in the way of timekeeping devices other than the sun. So sunrise, noon, sunset, moonrise, which is incredibly variable, were things everyone could see. And if you were in a prosperous and industrious locale, there would also be the hours struck by the clock in the center of town. But because every time you move a few miles or kilometers east or west, the when of noon is going to change. Understanding this is how early sailors figured out their progress east or west around the globe. This also meant, of course, you needed a clear day so you could see the sun and when noon happened, as well as someone to be completely on it when it came to turning over the hourglass, and for the darn thing to not get broken. But if you know anything about ocean weather, you know a dependable sighting at noon is often not possible, and sand glasses might not be 100% reliable on a listing boat. Thus, we had that race for a good watch that would work at sea so you could get the darn longitude. But back on land, the trouble was that if your train was starting in Town A, using Town A's local time, it wasn't certain that the time it would arrive in Town B would be anything close to the time according to the local time in Town B. thus people showing up hours early to catch their train and fretting as it got later and later. So yeah, spending extra time on the platform was one thing, but the big problem, of course, was that in many places in the early days of the railroad, there was only the one track. And so a train going east and one going west had to meet at the passing zones or wait to switch off a feeder track and such so they didn't, hit each other. And to do so successfully, they had to be using the same time. But if train A is using the local time at the east end of the track and train B is using the local time at the west end, well, the possibility of collision is greatly increased if they each have their own idea of what, say, 11:30 is. Sorry about the story problem flashbacks there. But in the early 19th century, it wasn't just trains and watches. It was also about pressure and capturing the power of steam. Steam engines started their industrial life, mostly as pumps for mines to keep the water out, but soon they would go on to power trains and sawmills and flour mills. As a result, the water wheel and the windmill start to get sidelined. And from these early food manufacturing applications, steam engines will also start to power things like cloth mills, sugar mills, and all manner of the harder labor aspects of breaking down raw food products on their way to becoming the food we recognize. The cloth mills are important because they are part of what makes cotton cloth cheaper, which in turn makes paper cheaper. Because up until the end of the 19th century, all paper outside of Asia comes from some sort of recycled cloth, cotton or linen. There's no wood pulp paper. And because of the cheaper cotton, paper is going to get less expensive. It's not cheap, but people can suddenly own more books. A non-obscenely wealthy person might easily own as many as 10 books. And a person in the emerging middle class in America could easily own a new cookbook or maybe even 2. And so, the American cookbook as a genre rather than a curiosity is invented, which is why this season there will start to be recipes. With the railroad, travel starts to be a thing that more people do, both to go to a new home, but it even begins to happen for leisure. So the American hotel is also created. It does grow out of the tavern inn tradition, but the wide open spaces of America, even when it's fewer than 25 states, combined with a certain sort of traveler who's seeking to be respectable but isn't nobility and isn't rich but isn't destitute, creates a style of American hotel and associated American dining unique to this country. It will even explain why Americans are generally confused by the fact that fancy award-winning restaurants that people flock to are found in hotels in other countries. Because most 20th century and even many 21st century American hotel restaurants are generally expensive, but mediocre or terrible. The first half of the century sees the American big city emerge at most of the major ports of the last century, and they spill into the surrounding countryside. For many people, longtime residents and new immigrants, life starts to feel too crowded or too expensive or already too formed. The earliest idea of a cross-continent country had emerged with the Louisiana Purchase and the Corps of Discovery trek. And it was these people who were feeling pressed by these masses of early 19th century humanity that started to make the idea of explosive expansion a reality. The Santa Fe, California, and Oregon trails, all starting out near Independence, Missouri, fed much of this push west by Americans, or at least by people who had spent time in America. Fun fact, an unknown number of people from Europe fleeing this war or that revolution or this criminal gang takeover of their farm came to America, and they just arrived here and had no particular citizenship status assigned to them. They ended up packing up and setting out to find a new home in one of the many loosely designated territories that weren't exactly America yet, but were often inhabited and hunted by local already present tribes. But since they and the land they were living on didn't have any official name slapped onto it by the people making and publishing maps for a living, it was just sort of territory. Now, if people had been closely tracking immigration data and citizenship status, many of the people settling in these territories likely would have received the designation of, interesting. And this doesn't even take into account the people who arrived here as servants or slaves. Sure, the important person would have gone through immigration and gotten status as a citizen or whatever, but many of the menials would have been classed as more or less baggage, leaving their immigration status in the "that's interesting, but I'm not sure" category as well. And it wasn't just a thirst for land pulling more people ever further west. There was also the strong lure of gold and silver. The Sutter's Mills strike in 1848 that started the California gold rush and created those minor 49ers happened near Sacramento, California, and made San Francisco the port and destination for both gold seekers and goods sellers. You could maybe make a fortune mining for gold, but you could definitely do well selling shovels and stakes, and then there's this whole egg war. We'll get to that. The initial gold find was followed by further silver and gold strikes, which led to mining towns in other parts of California, Nevada, Colorado, Utah, and other places along the Rocky Mountains range. And a wide-ranging mineral boom would follow. Industrial salt is also in development at this time. Solar-dried, coal-heated, and mined. Then there's new technology in metal for canning, and then there's glass for both food storage and windows. The ability to fully enclose buildings and yet light them without having to burn stuff, candles, whale oil, coal gas, or what have you, would completely change how big a factory could be and fundamentally what factories looked like. And this was even before the advent of electric lighting or electrically powered machinery. Because electricity, as anything beyond a scientific curiosity, that is firmly post-Civil War, which means the workday at the thread mill and the fish canning factory remained shorter in the winter than it did in the summer for years to come. During this period, if you wanted to go west, young man, or young woman, there were more than a few of those, it was the short and arduous way. They traveled on foot or alternately walked and rode with a team of oxen and a jouncey wagon. And while this is happening domestically, America is also entering the China trade. Even as the steamships were in development, the clipper ships, as a way to carry high-value cargo, tea mainly, and high-paying customers, started to move across the seas. And for what it's worth, the precursors of the America's Cup sailing race were laid down here as well. The fact that the boats today look like sort of alien watercraft using outrageous and expensive designs and technology is completely in keeping with their clipper ship origins. The colonies that made America were built to be suppliers to Europe for food, for naval stores, for cash crops like sugar and cotton and rice and indigo. The plan was for these colonies and even for the young country to be mainly exporters. But in the early 19th century, as the new country broke all sorts of rules in transport, in mechanization, and shipbuilding, the new America would also become an importer. At this stage, yes, it was still mostly about fine and fancy things, but Americans were able to buy and were interested in buying these things from around the world. The American appetite for tea, coffee, opium and laudanum, citrus fruits, sugar, fine metalwork, fancy glass items, silk, books, and live dancing and theater entertainments also made the new country an importer. They welcomed items, actors, and talented artisans, craftsmen, and technicians. More than one country embargoed the immigration of members of certain trades, like glassmaker, metalworker, or fuller, which is a cloth processor and dyer, to the new U.S., but entrepreneurs and investors would often find ways around. In this first half of the 19th century, New America stops looking like a British appendage. It doesn't quite know what it's going to be or what it's going to look like, or even how big it's going to end up. But at this point, all of the organizational systems of Europe no longer work. Every man who is regarded as an entire person, if he doesn't like what's going on, he can just move somewhere else. And any idea of homogeneous ideology is absolutely impossible. There are people from everywhere bonking into each other in the cities and on the trail out to new territories. This period of America is chaotic and unsettled in ways that we, with our power grids and paved roads and mapped real estate, find hard to imagine. Such an unsettled state, especially one that is not centered around a war, or at least not one central war, cannot last. And seeing how American food will develop during this unsettled period and then begins to settle down is what Season 4 is going to be all about. So join me next week as I dive all the way in on iron, the railroads, the steam boilers, early gear drives, and the move out of the fireplace and on to stovetops, and how all of this lays down much of the foundation upon which American food will be built. Thanks for listening. Any email questions or quibbles will continue to reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Downloading the episodes helps me know that you're out there, but even better than that are your reviews. Let more people know that you're listening and enjoying the show, or at least find it interesting. I'm also doing a deep dive into the 19th century with a co-host, Jamie Lewis of Plague of Strength. It's our much looser and rather wilder podcast, Prize Fighters, Circus Freaks, and Gangsters. Still food, but now with fashion, fighting, and fraud, and as we go along, there are ever more Fs. Which means, no, I can't keep it E for everyone. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and you can find me on Threads and Insta and just generally out there in the social media as @THOA Food, and all this info is available in the show description.